word abomination is commonly used by Christians when arguing against homosexuality, along with other things they claim is particularly offensive in the eyes of God. However, that would heavily imply it would be in extremely limited use, since God is clearly very loving, and therefore, in a Christian context, wouldn't necessarily be calling everything severely hated. But doing a search for that particular word in the King James Bible, you get, and I'm not lying, 142 results for that word. I don't think it's just the word, I think it's actually the verses that word can crop up in. Most of them seem to be in the Old Testament, and many of those in the book of Ezekiel. He even got his weight edgier than my video on his sense of humour suggests. Or there's more to the word abomination than just one usage can allow for. So, this is going to be a deep dive into the abominations of the Bible to see if we can shed a light on what our God finds so hideous. I'll be honest, this has been a very hard one to do. Made even harder by the fact the term abomination is hard to narrow down in the first place, even in a consistent manner due to the translations being inconsistent with the number of occurrences. Some Bibles mention it quite a few times, others very few times at all. The Jubilee Bible has the most 150 verses containing at least one reference to it. I know there are at least a couple of verses that have a few mentions of that word, whilst quite a few don't even mention the word at all. I think God's Word and the Good Message Bible all refuse to use the word abomination. Thus the word is applied to far more than just things that are obviously abhorrent to God. To the Egyptians, for example, the word abomination is used quite often, but it's to them, to the Egyptians, who think that being a shepherd or eating with them is seen as an abomination. So clearly, even the biblical authors accepted as more than one type of abomination, and not all of them are in God's eyes. Now, having to delve into the Hebrew word, the most often used translation is from Toba, which is commonly translated from Hebrew to both abomination and detestable. As a result, one can take this to mean that it's what God considers detestable and horrible to watch. However, when doing research for this video, one of the verses that came up recommended at the top of my page was from the book of Daniel, chapter 9, verse 27.
He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And at the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him.
Referenced in the New Testament, which often means it needs attention, since why would Christ reference it? Why would it be referenced by him? It constantly refers to the abomination of the desolation over the temple. But that's hardly giving any context at all. Even going over the rest of Daniel doesn't really help us. This isn't helped by the fact it doesn't even use the same word as in much of the rest of the Bible. It's not Toba, it's Shekut. According to Misfit Ministries, Shekuts and its masculine counterpart, Shekets, means idolatrous, basically something that's worshipped as an idol. Which makes sense since an idol of destruction can mean either a god of destruction or worshipping the destruction as though it was a god. This is backed up by the New Testament mentioning it in the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where the Greek word thelugma is used, meaning detestable or idolatry. So does this mean we've solved the mystery of the abominations before we've begun? Well, no. Because when just going over other verses that include the word abomination, something interesting stood out. In the second book of Kings, chapter 23, verse 13, it mentions the temples of certain abominable gods.
The king also desecrated the high places east of Jerusalem, to the south of the Mount of Corruption, which King Solomon of Israel had built for Ashtoreth, the abomination of the Sidonians, for Chemosh, the abomination of the Moabites, and for Molech, sometimes called Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites.
These gods had degrees of human sacrifice, fornication, and sorcery involved in their worship, and this was embodied by the tribes who worshipped them. Nothing unusual there, as whole chapters of Leviticus mention the worship of Molech as something to avoid, along with the sexual acts common amongst the Ammonites. The interesting part is the words used, because both Astoreth and Chemosh get the term Shekuts used for them, while a Molech is given the word Hobah. Now, the Hebrew script doesn't make them look anything the same at all, so clearly the distinction is important. It could be a fancier way of calling them different things, or mentioning them as similar, but one being more hated than any of the others. However, it seems to be lost on many biblical translators, who simply translate them as the same word most of the time. So there's probably nothing special about the words or their usage. So why do so many people wave the word abomination around? I'm inclined to look through the Bible to find what is referred to as an abomination and see by the negative what God wants for us. I mean, I've already done by the positive, so let's try the negative, see if that confirms it. Surprisingly, the Bible helps on its own by giving us a list of things hated by God in Proverbs chapter 6, verse 16.
These 6 things the Lord hates, yes, 7 are an abomination to him: a proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that are swift in running to evil, a false witness who speaks lies, and one who sows discord amongst brethren.
Some of these make sense as great things, including pride, murder, and lying, and of course, deceiving people. However, this doesn't exactly help narrow things down, especially as the language and numbers confuse things. 6 of these things God hates, but 7 are abominations? Yes. Even there's one that is particularly abhorrent, all the word abomination isn't as powerful a word as hate in this context. It could also be that it was originally 6. No, wait, hang on, 7! There's 7 of them! Could be that confusion, and it just didn't pass over properly in the books. To try and sort this out, I decided to look into the etymology of the words. Now, I've already mentioned the Hebrew words for abomination, but the English is derived from the Latin term abominationum, the noun of which, abominare, means shun as an ill omen. It further mentions that the biblical use means that which is ceremonially impure, heavily implying a more human distinction. But it is mentioned that it's also potentially derived from ab homine, meaning away from man or beastly. So it could just be that the abomination is just something that animals do and not human. It's really not clear on that point at all. So, if that's the case, what about hate? Well, the original Hebrew word, sani, does turn up a number of times in the Bible, but is rarely in relation to God's hating of certain things on earth. So, what about the English etymology? Unfortunately, hate has a Germanic root, not a Latin one, so it's not going to be anywhere near as close, but it does come from the Proto-Germanic hauding, which comes from the Proto-Indo-European cad, meaning sorrow or hatred. Though interestingly, it also has the root for the Greek kaidos, meaning care, trouble, sorrow, mourning, and funeral rites. However, this doesn't help us with this passage, and the word hate is more consistent in this verse than abomination, and has in other verses been used to mean enmity, to mention enemies and those who turned against God, and also those who are unloved. A classic example of this is Jacob's first wife, Leah, as she was said to be unloved by him, often even said to be hated by him. Since this a stab child question wasn't getting me anywhere, I decided to search for what people say the Bible calls abominations. If there's anything that helped narrow down the criteria. Bible Hub has an index of sorts on the reoccurrence and context of certain terms in the original language. In this case, the term toba is used in several contexts in both a ritual and ethical sense. Most ritual ones tend to involve fairness, idolatry, and witchcraft, and the ethical ones include sacrifice of the wicked and chastity, which refers to sexual sins. This categorization, however, hits a problem on several things. Firstly, that fairness should be an ethical problem, and certainly the ritualization of human sacrifice, which often turns up in witchcraft, should also be an ethical sin. If nothing else more so than BestChristianity.com has a list of abominations in the Bible and is quite extensive. For some reason, it groups them together, which is either an attempt to categorize them or more likely a learning tool for group work. I personally think it's the latter, since the groups only seldom have consistent themes. To see whether these were able to help, and an online Bible word study didn't give me much help either, I decided my best route was to take independent notes, which gave me a better understanding as to what God considers abominations. Using the references to abominations on bestofchristianity.com and Bible Hub, and work my way through to look at the context surrounding it. With this method in mind, which is more than likely flawed in several areas, I have been able to narrow down some categories of abominations: idolatry, unfairness, dishonesty, wicked thoughts, and foolishness. So, how can these be considered the most offensive things to God? Well, let's take a look at them. Idolatry is mostly about worshipping anything other than God. And since many of the tribal religions of the Middle East at the time consisted of sacrificing humans and children, bloodletting, and ritual fornication, this would certainly suggest that God doesn't like people to kill for his sake or sacrifice good lives that could have potential. And certainly, turning one's gaze away from a God who embodies goodness and focusing on something that they made themselves just so they can feel better about themselves is definitely not a good idea. People say that's what we do in modern times anyway. I've got to admit that is somewhat true, but it's far better to have a somewhat established one that we can all see the morals work around. Unfairness and dishonesty are closely linked. Many passages say that the unbalanced scale or the false balance is an abomination. Since lying is also seen as an abomination, the two tend to be linked together as a dishonest deal. It looks as though God dislikes those who are false in their dealings, scams people, testifies falsely against people, often for their own gain, and refuses to help those in need, often looking down on them, letting the unfairness live on without a care in the world. Wicked thoughts and deeds cover a wide array of potential sins. The Bible tells us some that are particularly horrendous. These include turning away from God, which means going against God's commandments, passing a woman around and claiming her in painful times, simply letting her go when she needs you the most and taking her back when she's just desperate for company, just take advantage of her. Contradicting moralities. Basically, someone who doesn't like that you are doing good, which is in your culture, but it is considered bad in their culture. Those sort of things can clash. Stealing from temples, which primarily mentions idols of gold and silver, but I'm thinking that the gold and silver are still belong to the nation who made them and therefore should be left. Far from the fact you're taking the symbols out of their temples. Hypocrisy. One rule for me and one rule for everyone else. Again, you see that in politics today. Child sacrifice through witchcraft. Many covens at the time did just that. And being haughty, being smug because you don't have the hardship or poverty of others. If anyone came into your life with a backstory of these acts, you wouldn't want to associate with them, unless you were similarly nasty, in which case I would not want to associate. It's easy to see why God doesn't look favourably upon them. Foolishness sounds rather mild, but when you bear in mind what things can be classified as foolish, you can understand why such things wouldn't be a good idea to pass on. These include believing rumours without investigating, believing those full of anger and who are spouting lies, speaking before you know the whole story, allowing yourself to be manipulated, making your own items of worship or making your own gods, and ignoring God. These are indeed the minor ones, but since most of them seem linked with assumptions, it can still be important to remember them. But since the things I classified as taking unnecessary risk fall under the bracket of being foolish, or at least can, I'm including them here. And they include getting excessively drunk, making too big an offering that cannot be consumed before it spoils, letting it go to waste as a result, eating meat of carrion eaters like crows or vultures, spreading animal-borne pathogens by interfering with those animals in their natural environments, sexual activity outside the bands of marriage. This does include homosexuality, and therefore more or less confirms my theory of unnecessary risking the spread of STDs. Ignoring the wisdom of others, which is extremely important. Not taking due safety precautions when praying or at worship. Some foolishness is certainly mild, but others can be life-threatening, and so are considered foolhardy at best. Now, it's worth remembering, whilst witchcraft can be linked with wicked deeds and idolatry due to the association with bloodletting and fornication, it can be classified as foolishness. As for the consulting with spirits, demons, and the dead, and so forth, it can be considered a great risk, though I'm not inclined towards demonology and so don't allow them room in my philosophy. That being said, if half of what is said about demons in popular culture alone connecting with them is still a bad idea, and would certainly be seen as foolish by God. I've seen a number of trailers for films that demons, ghosts, whatever, and if even half of them are right, we can contain grain the truth. Definitely not sort of creatures you want to be hanging around. So all things considered, an abomination in the eyes of God appears to be something that negatively affects humans in the long run. Be it by ripping people off, breaking their trust with people by deceit and lying, being uncaring about people's feelings, that includes racism, classism, and elitism, being stubborn in one's beliefs, even if someone is using them to manipulate you, taking huge risks with little to no reward, and indulging in short-term pleasures that have risks of harming others, which includes drunkenness, fornication, and extravagance. It does sound an awful lot like my video on what is sin, and I've got to admit there's a huge amount of overlap. I'll come to that a bit more later on. But what does this tell us about abominations? Not much more than anything else the Bible says is hated by God. But despite this anticlimactic search, that I'm rather disappointed didn't disprove any theories I had, since I was expecting a bit more of a challenge there, it does give us some conclusions. Firstly, my theory of STD transmission isn't that far-fetched, since many of the things mentioned as abominations can cause the rampant spread of pathogens such as E. coli, salmonella, SARS, and many other diseases, including the COVID-19 virus. And even those that come from meat-eating animals, like crows or vultures. This makes STD transmission a plausible reason to make unnecessary copulation an offence. And unfortunately, that is particular with homosexual copulation, since it doesn't offset the risk of transmission with potential of new life. Second, it shows God cares about us in the long term. Murder, rape, child sacrifice, and so forth are all horrific and are banned by other commandments, including the 10. But most of them happen in the short term and have immediate effects. However, some things, like allowing cultures that perpetuate those acts in principle and practice, like witchcraft, idolatry, and worshipping other gods, not caring about each other's feelings, or allowing extreme foolishness to occur, to integrate into your society and then let them grow, they can start off a small movement that grows and grows into something far bigger and far more dangerous. Yes, we are more aware of sexually transmitted diseases and therefore aware of what can happen when two people populate. But does that mean that it was safe for people back in the days before contraception was available, before protection was available for both men and women? Unlikely. The fact that people had to take so many tests these days shows that we still don't understand it today. As a wise man once said, low falls can lead to heavy floods. Thirdly, God cares about us, mentally, physically, and emotionally, not just spiritually. Our hearts, minds, and bodies are all important to Him. He hates those things that can put them at risk, including that which we may not see. His 10 Commandments narrows down some things that we specifically follow. But he gives us general laws that we can follow, and they mostly focus on things that will kill us in the long term, not just in the short. So there we have it. Abominations, summed up. Even with many people using the term abomination like the killer word to end the discussion, sometimes they use it purely for only a couple of things and then claim that's all that word means. And say that because it means that, it must mean something extremely serious. However, I find it rather interesting that even those religious fanatics who hate shows like Frozen fail to call Olaf the snowman an abominable snowman. which really makes sense since he was made by magic, hence witchcraft, hence it's an abomination, hence he's abominable. That's an interesting thing. But that shows how the meaning of the word has lost its power in today's society. And second, that they hardly ever spend time examining their own words, let alone those used in God's holy book. Ultimately, calling someone an abomination is pretty useless these days. It's not the use of the C word now becoming an endearment. It's a pleasant thing, in my opinion. But he's not bandying it around that much. It's no longer going to have the same effect. As another wise man once said, speak least, it could be most often heard. So remember that, my friends. Keep the faith, and God be with you.